Good evening. My name is Paul Silva, and I'm a natural resource specialist for the Coastal Fisheries Division of Texas Parks and Wildlife. I would like to thank the Coastal Bend Bays Foundation for this opportunity to share my Dagger Island restoration project at this Coastal Issues Forum. I would also like to acknowledge the Coastal Bend Bays Foundation for their continuing efforts to promote environmental conservation, providing educational and outreach events that advocate for the responsible and sustainable ways to protect our natural resources, and lastly, for recognizing and celebrating the environmental stewards in our community, industries, and education systems at their annual awards banquet. Texas Parks and Wildlife is tasked by the state legislature to take care of the natural and cultural resources of Texas, not only for the residents, but the millions of visitors that come to our state. These visitors play an important role in providing economic revenue for our state by participating in tourist activities, using our restaurants and hotels, and partaking in the multitude of cultural and educational resources our state has to offer. In addition, Texas Parks and Wildlife regulates hunting and fishing to ensure opportunities for recreational activities are available for present and future generations. So why is this Dagger Island project important? Well, first, it meets the mission of Texas Parks and Wildlife, as well as protecting and conserving natural resources in our own backyard here in Corpus Christi. And second, it provides protection for essential habitats that support a healthy ecosystem and fishing opportunities. To get everyone on the same page, the first thing I'd like to do is show you exactly where the project is located. The project is in Redfish Bay, which is a secondary bay within the larger Aransas Bay system. Redfish Bay is north of the Corpus Christi Ship Channel and contains Dagger and Ransom Islands chain. The restoration project will target two sections of Dagger Island, as identified by the yellow boxes, that have been heavily impacted by natural and human causes. One of the main reasons this site was selected was because of its location within the Redfish Bay State Scientific Area. Texas Parks and Wildlife created the scientific area for the purpose of protecting and studying the 5 species of native seagrasses found in this area. The area contains approximately 50 square miles of prime fisheries habitat, including over 14,000 acres of submerged seagrass beds dominated by turtle and shoalgrass. In addition to the seagrass, the state scientific area also contains other fragile biological communities, including oyster reefs, mangroves, and estuarine marshes that serve as a valuable feeding and nursery habitat for both commercial and recreational fisheries, as well as avian species. The shoreline of this island is eroding due to both natural and human causes. The natural causes include predominant southeast winds, storm events, and decades of sea level rise accompanied by subsidence. The human impacts causing erosion include high energy ship wakes caused by vessels traveling down the Corpus Christi Ship Channel and extensive dredging from past oil and gas explorations. Because of the ecological and economical importance of this area, Texas Parks and Wildlife is concerned that if the shoreline erosion of Dagger Island continues, it could have harmful impacts on the aquatic resources within and surrounding the Redfish Bay State Scientific Area. With the proposed widening and deepening of the Corpus Christi Ship Channel and the increased frequency and intensity of larger ship wakes, the erosion rates likely will increase along these unprotected shorelines. The goal of this project is to protect and conserve approximately 5 acres of diverse estuarine habitats within the Redfish Bay State Scientific Area. Also, provide protection to areas with the highest erosion rate, as well as restore a section of the island to historical size through the construction of a beneficial use site. Dagger and Ransom Islands are a series of low-lying narrow islands with a typical high marsh vegetation, including patches of mangroves. The adjacent Redfish Bay, which Dagger and Ransom Islands protect, is a very large tidal flat that contains vast meadows of 5 seagrass species. This historical view shows the physical changes of Dagger Island and the surrounding habitats over time, as it has been impacted by both natural and anthropogenic activities. In total, over 125 acres of Dagger Island has been lost since 1956. Not only is erosion occurring, but the islands are actually migrating to the southwest due to sediment movement caused by longshore transport of eroded material. This transported material ends up in the GIWW or the Corpus Christi Ship Channel, resulting in the need for maintenance dredging every 5 to 10 years. The erosion varies throughout the 4.2-mile length of the island, with the highest rates at the extreme ends of the chain. The first step to this project is to evaluate ways to slow down or stop this erosion. In 2008, Texas Parks and Wildlife contracted HDR Engineering to conduct a desktop analysis of alternatives for shoreline protection of both Dagger and Ransom Islands. 11 protection options were evaluated based on 12 construction factors, including feasibility, environmental conditions, habitat impacts, and socio-economic considerations. These factors were given a numerical rating, and each shoreline protection method was given a score. The 3 best methods will then be analyzed at a greater extent to determine projected costs, environmental impacts, constructability, and effectiveness. The results of the desktop analysis identified onshore revetment, nearshore and offshore breakwaters as the best shoreline protection methods to further investigate. Due to the length of Dagger Island, Texas Parks and Wildlife will prioritize shorelines to be protected and define the goals and the success criteria for each shoreline. HDR recommended that a licensed state land survey be conducted to delineate the private property so that it would not be included in this project. Beneficial use of dredge material would also be considered as a protection method that would fill large breaches of the island. Initial assessment of the 3 stabilization methods identified the pros and cons of each one, but further information would need to be obtained before a final decision could be made. This would include conducting bathymetric surveys to assess depths along the shoreline. Topographical surveys were also needed to identify island elevations and plant diversity. It would also include sediment sampling to verify the bottom would be able to support the protection method selected. And lastly, habitat surveys would need to be performed to identify potential impacts to the natural resources. Preliminary cost analysis identified revetment as a least costly option, with offshore segmented breakwaters being the most expensive, although it also would be the most environmentally friendly. Due to the long length of Dagger and Ransom Island shorelines, costs of protecting the entire shoreline would be very expensive. Based on the erosion rates, Texas Parks and Wildlife prioritized the sites with the highest erosion rates. Priority 1 includes the extreme ends of the islands. The southern end is privately owned, and the northern end has extensive seagrass beds near the shoreline, so an offshore breakwater would be the best, although the most costly option. The majority of Priority 2 is still on private property, and at this time the owner was not interested in participating in the project. Priority Site 3 has erosion occurring on the southern end with large breaches and accretion on the northern reach. Texas Parks and Wildlife does not have the expertise required to design, plan, and construct breakwaters or the beneficial use levees, so Ducks Unlimited was hired to conduct the necessary surveys and oversee the project construction. Ducks Unlimited began the environmental assessments to determine the best option of the 3 suggested by the desktop analysis. Once the surveys were completed, it was determined that the nearshore and offshore breakwater options were the least environmentally harmful solutions. To rebuild a lost section of the island, a beneficial use component was discussed. In addition, we identified the furthest extent southward where we could go before coming to private land. The benthic surveys and topographical data was collected by both Ducks Unlimited and Texas Parks and Wildlife staff. With these surveys, we were able to determine where the seagrass and oyster reefs were located, how much rock would be needed for the breakwaters, the size of the proposed beneficial use site, and the habitat impacts of the project. Cross-section transits over Ransom Island will be used as a template when developing the habitat design on a new beneficial use site. These surveys also indicated that a 0.31 acre oyster reef was located within the footprint of the proposed beneficial use site and would need to be located prior to construction. For any restoration project, you have to evaluate the pros and cons, including habitat impacts, funding, long-term sustainability, economic benefits, fisheries benefits, and since we are a state agency, what are the recreational and environmental benefits? For the Dagger project, we are protecting over 5,000 acres of estuarine habitat, constructing over 1.3 miles of rock breakwater protection that will also serve as invertebrate and fisheries habitat, and then restoring 25 acres of lost island habitat while only impacting 31 acres of degraded habitat. In addition, once the breakwaters and the beneficial use site are completed, over 90 acres of seagrass that had been lost due to wave and wind action should reestablish in the bare areas behind the island. The project has additional benefits, including reducing the island migration and thus reducing the need for dredging the GIWW and the Corpus Christi ship channel, protecting Ingleside shoreline, and then creating new wildlife habitat, as well as improving water quality in the bay. The value of these shallow water resources to recreational fisheries in Redfish Bay is evident by recent angler surveys collected from 2013 to 2017. Southern Redfish Bay represents only about 7% of the aerial extent of Corpus Christi Bay ecosystem. Yet the survey data indicates that this small area accounted for over 18% of the angling trips taken by boat and over 21% of the angler hours spent through the Corpus Christi Bay system. These survey data also indicated that southern Redfish Bay accounted for 37% of sea trout, 31% of red drum, 23% of southern flounder, and 12% of black drum landed throughout the Corpus Christi Bay system. In 2012, Texas Parks and Wildlife developed a master plan to protect the shorelines of Dagger and Ransom Island. This plan included constructing a segmented offshore breakwater at Ransom Point, a nearshore breakwater protecting the beneficial use site, as well as a nearshore breakwater protecting South Dagger Island. Originally, we had a grandiose plan to protect and restore as much of Dagger and Ransom Island as possible. Unfortunately, we had to scale back multiple times due to property boundaries and budget constraints. So let's look at the individual parts of the project. The southern nearshore breakwater is located approximately 10 feet from the shoreline to avoid the seagrass beds. To avoid impacts to shallow water habitat, the rock was barged to the terminal ends of the island, then transported down the island and placed into the water with the use of an excavator. The beneficial use site was a combination of a nearshore breakwater and a containment levee that will be used to create a 25-acre island. Once the containment levee is filled, it will be contoured for different wetland habitats and a nesting beach for birds. The northernmost section of the project was the offshore segmented breakwaters adjacent to Ransom Point. In 2012, Texas Parks and Wildlife was approached by Cheniere to assume this portion of the project as mitigation for expansion of their plant. Since this portion of the project was the most expensive at approximately $9 million, Texas Parks and Wildlife was more than happy to let Cheniere take over the building of these breakwaters. This is a final product of the offshore breakwaters at Ransom Point. There were some minor adjustments to the length and alignment, but overall this breakwater serves as providing a healthy environment to seagrass and oyster beds in the adjacent areas. Texas Parks and Wildlife applied for funding for this project through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund. These funds were restitution from the Deepwater explosion and oil spill, and after several conversations with the committee, funds look promising for the Dagger Island project. With the completion of the project design and now a source of funding for the project, the next step was to procure the state and federal permits necessary to construct the project. And it looked like from the design it was going to cost about $3.8 million to complete the project. Unfortunately, Mother Nature came into the picture. On August 17, 2017, Hurricane Harvey landed on San Jose Island as a Category 4 hurricane with wind speeds of 130 miles per hour, causing severe damage from winds, high tides, and tidal surges. In addition, the stalling of the hurricane caused torrential rains, resulting in massive flooding along the coast. To evaluate the impacts of Hurricane Harvey on the project, additional topographic and bathytic surveys were taken adjacent to Dagger Island. Benthic surveys showed substantial changes in the bathymetry around Dagger Island, which will require either regrading of the bay floor or additional rock to raise the elevations of the breakwater. To alleviate any impacts to the natural resources, it was decided to add more rock, which will require a significant fundraising effort to raise over $500,000 necessary to purchase the additional rock. With the help of Ducks Unlimited, funding was attained through the North American Wetland Conservation Act and the Coastal Conservation Association Building Conservation Trust entities. In addition, new contract plans were created and submitted to the Corps of Engineers for approval. In November of 2017, Texas Parks and Wildlife was awarded a $4.1 million contract from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation to construct the breakwaters and a beneficial use site. Later in February 2018, Texas Parks and Wildlife also received a $100,000 grant from the General Land Office to construct living shorelines behind the breakwaters. Then in June of 2018, we received our permits from the Corps of Engineers and TCEQ to continue with the project. And lastly, we developed a Memorandum of Understanding with Buckeye Partners to obtain the dredge material to fill the beneficial use site. So these are the final design plans for the project, which included 2 nearshore breakwaters and a 25-acre beneficial use site. The last thing we needed to do before construction began was a relocation of the oyster reef within the footprint of the beneficial use site. Location of the oyster reef was performed by Texas Parks and Wildlife staff and volunteers by manual means. In total, the relocation to an adjacent oyster reef required 14 field trips and over 380 man-hours, but resulted in the conservation of over 6.9 tons of oyster and shell material. The relocated oysters will be monitored for the next 5 years to document their survival and growth. Unfortunately, due to the COVID pandemic, Buckeye Partners was purchased by an international company. As a result, the MOU was terminated, so we had to find another dredge material source. But we continued on. Paget Construction was awarded the contract for the breakwaters and the BU levees in November of 2019 and began construction in January of 2020. It took them 7 months to complete the project on July 15th. The construction project used 3 marsh excavators, 3 barges, and a staff of 7 people. It's unbelievable that so much work could be done by so few people in such a short time frame. Here are some pictures of the construction of the breakwaters and beneficial use levees. Here's a picture of the completed beneficial use levees and a nearshore breakwater. Texas Parks and Wildlife is currently seeking a donor for approximately 250,000 cubic yards of dredge material to fill this site. This is an overview of the final nearshore breakwaters constructed along the south part of Dagger Island. With the construction completed, the Living Shoreline Planting Project was awarded to Triton Environmental. Triton was able to utilize plants within the construction area as well as those in the surrounding island area for the donor material. They planted salt marsh cordgrass in the intertidal zone and salt meadow cordgrass at the higher elevations to stabilize the beneficial use levees. It took them 3 weeks to complete the plant. Not only did they plant between the breakwater and the shoreline, but they were also able to restore eroded away marsh on the back side of South Dagger Island. Here are some pictures of the planting process. Just when you think the project is complete and ready to wrap up, Mother Nature strikes again. On July 25th, 2020, Hurricane Hannah visited the coast. It landed in Port Mansfield as a Category 1, and peak winds in the Port Aransas area got up to 52 miles an hour. In addition, the water levels rose to 3.75 feet above mean sea level, which means it went over the breakwaters that were constructed at Dagger Island. Unfortunately, the plantings were heavily impacted, as were the beneficial use levees. As you can see in the pictures, the plants got buried in the wreck debris, and the levees were eroded due to the wave, wind, and tidal surge. Due to the continuing presence of tropical activity through November of 2020, the replanting was postponed until the spring of 2021. Luckily, we had some restitution funds available to have the contractors return and repair the BU levees. At the present time, the levees are back to proper elevation and building specifications. Texas Parks and Wildlife is still actively pursuing donors for dredge material, and hopefully we will identify one soon. So where do we go from here? There are still some more tasks to be completed on Dagger Island, but we must be diligent in continuing to protect the Redfish Bay area. Texas Parks and Wildlife will continue to evaluate shoreline protection and enhancement projects in the area, but we are concerned with the increasing industrial development in the area. We will continue to work with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and other federal and state agencies to ensure that these new developments adhere to the laws that protect our natural resources. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about Dagger Island, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Just enter your questions into the chat box and I will do my best to answer them all. Thank you very much.